When the world stayed silent, she heard the whales sing, a story of loss, misunderstanding, and the quiet fight to be truly seen. By Woo Young Woo. The day began like every other weekday, with the low hum of the subway moving beneath Seoul. I stood in my usual spot, just behind the yellow tactile paving. The morning was cool, a little damp from overnight rain, which made the surface slightly slippery. I adjusted my stance so my shoes were perfectly aligned with the grooves beneath my feet. It felt correct. Safe. The train arrived on time. I entered with the same number of steps as always, 5 forward, 3 to the side. I found the corner I preferred and leaned against the wall. The car was quiet today. No one talked. I closed my eyes and imagined the ocean. Somewhere far beneath the surface, a blue whale was gliding through the water. It would be alone, but not lonely. I like to think whales understood silence in a way that humans didn't. By the time I reached the Hanbada office, the streets were already crowded. I walked quickly, head lowered. I didn't need to look at the crosswalk signals. I knew the patterns. Inside the building, the lights hummed quietly. The front desk clerk greeted me with a small wave. I nodded in return, stepping into the elevator and pressing the button for the 11th floor. At my desk, I noticed a new envelope resting on the surface, pale blue, sealed with wax. There was no return address. The color reminded me of the ocean on a cloudy day. The wax seal had a faint imprint of what looked like a wave or possibly a feather. I ran my fingers along the edge of the paper before opening it. Inside was a letter, handwritten, unusual. The man who wrote it introduced himself as So Ji-hoon. His daughter, Harin, had died during a school field trip. She had drowned in a river. He had been accused of negligence, of allowing her to wander away while he was distracted. The school claimed she should never have gone, that he had ignored their warnings, that he failed to disclose her autism diagnosis. But he said none of that was true. He wrote that people had already made up their minds about him, that they saw a tragedy and wanted someone to blame. He wrote that he didn't expect sympathy, only that someone might look closely before deciding. At the end of the letter, he said he thought I might understand because I would notice the things other people didn't. I read the letter twice. I didn't know Mr. So, I didn't know his daughter, but something in his words felt familiar, not in content, but in rhythm. He had taken care in how he explained things, not dramatic, not defensive, just quiet. I decided to review the case. The reports from the school were clinical. Ha-rin had slipped away during lunch. Mr. So had been on a phone call, the teachers said. When they noticed she was missing, it was too late. She had wandered toward the water. There was no fence. She couldn't swim. The school had previously advised that she not attend the trip due to the lack of trained staff. They said Mr. So insisted she go anyway, that he signed no waiver. They had warned him. That was their version. But when I read the parent-teacher emails, the picture changed. There were messages from Mr. So requesting support for his daughter during the trip. He had asked repeatedly about the presence of a classroom aide or shadow teacher. The messages were polite but persistent. Several were marked urgent. None of them had replies. There had once been a part-time aide assigned to Harin. She had resigned 2 weeks before the trip. There had been no replacement. This was confirmed in the staff attendance logs, but it was not mentioned in the school's testimony. There were more details in the counselor's notes. They showed that Harin required supervision outdoors. She was nonverbal and sensitive to loud sounds, especially whistles. She was prone to walking away when anxious. The school had known this. The notes had been in her file for over a year. The records painted a different picture. Mr. So hadn't been negligent. He had been worried. He had reached out. He had tried to prevent what happened, and he had been ignored. The first time I met Mr. So, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were clean but worn. His shoulders sagged in a way that made his tall frame seem smaller. He didn't speak much, and I didn't ask questions. He gave me a folder with documents, medical forms, therapy summaries, photos, and a laminated drawing. It was a picture his daughter had made a few days before she died. A large blue whale under a bright yellow sun. The whale's eyes were large and round. The colors were uneven. The ocean was drawn with long blue lines that curved at the edges like waves curling in on themselves. I didn't know why he brought it, but I kept looking at it long after he left. The case moved quickly. There was media interest, which added pressure to resolve it. The school maintained their position. The prosecution focused on the phone call, the moment Mr. Seo had turned away. That moment became the whole story. In court, the atmosphere was controlled, but I could feel the tension. The air had weight. Reporters sat in the back row. The judge watched carefully. I presented the timeline, each step, each email, each request Mr. Seo had made. I showed the staffing logs, the resignation of the aide, and the counselor's assessments. I explained how the school had failed to prepare, even after repeated notices. Finally, I included a piece of audio from a staff Zoom call that had been recorded for administrative purposes. One teacher's mic had been left on. She made a joke about the case in the background, about how that girl barely knew where she was most days. The comment was casual, thoughtless, but it showed something important: a lack of care, a lack of responsibility. The courtroom was silent when it played, not because it was shocking, but because it was familiar. People had heard things like it before. They just didn't often hear them out loud. When the trial ended, the judge didn't speak right away. There was a long pause, the kind that makes you feel time differently. And then it was done. Mr. So was cleared of all charges. He stood next to me, his hands still clutching the drawing of the whale. He didn't smile. His expression didn't change, but I saw the way his shoulders lifted just slightly, like he had been holding something too heavy for too long and had finally let part of it go. We left the building together. Outside, the city moved on without pause. People rushed past us, taxis honked. Somewhere someone laughed loudly. But in the space between us, there was quiet. Back at my desk, I placed the blue envelope in the bottom drawer next to a small wooden orca figure I'd had since I was a child. I looked out the window toward the Han River. The water was gray-blue. The clouds were low. It reminded me of the whale drawing: soft, heavy skies, gentle waves. I thought about the case, not as a win, but as a reminder. People often wanted to believe in simple explanations. They didn't want to look closely. But the truth was rarely loud. Sometimes it was found in details that others overlooked. Sometimes it was in what wasn't said. Mr. So didn't need someone to save him. He had needed someone to see him. I turned back to my desk. The office was still buzzing with low conversations and the hum of fluorescent lights. The day would continue, and so would the work. But for now, I allowed myself to be still. Some cases didn't leave you with answers, just understanding. And sometimes that was enough. Part 2: The Echo. After the verdict, my days returned to their usual shape. Morning commutes on the subway, files lined up on my desk like patient birds waiting to be studied. The Han River outside my window looked the same as always: broad, calm, a surface that gave away nothing. But something had shifted. I noticed it when I tried to focus on a contract dispute between two logistics companies. The documents were well organized. The argument is clear. But as I read, my thoughts drifted. I kept seeing that drawing, the blue whale under a jagged sun, drawn by a hand still learning how to control a crayon. It sat in my memory like a photo pinned behind glass. Fixed, but alive. The case with Mr. So had closed, but it lingered, not in the facts or the judgment, but in the way it made me think differently about silence. About how much was said in the spaces between people. About how much people carried without showing it. I started walking more after work. Not far. Just along the path by the river near the Banpo Bridge. I watched joggers pass, their headphones tucked neatly into their ears. Couples strolled slowly. Children pointed at pigeons. Everyone moved in rhythms I could understand, but not always join. There was a tree by the water with a bench underneath it. I sat there sometimes, holding a notebook I didn't write in. I liked the quiet. It reminded me of courtrooms after the judge had left. Still, but full of something unspoken. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the buildings, a boy walked by with his mother. He wore headphones and flapped his hands when a cyclist rang a bell too loudly. His mother knelt beside him and touched his back gently. Her face looked tired but calm. They stayed near the edge of the water for a while. The boy pointed to something I couldn't see and made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. And she nodded. Then they left. I watched them go. I didn't know their story, but I understood something about it. At Hanbada, the firm took on a new case involving a housing dispute. Two families were contesting ownership of a duplex purchased under a verbal agreement that had never been documented. It was complicated and full of old grievances. Both sides were angry. Both sides believed they were right. I was assigned to assist. Most of the case involved reviewing property transfer logs and city zoning records. Logical, sequential. But as I went through the files, I began noticing the same thing I had seen in Mr. So's case. Gaps. Missing pieces that everyone assumed weren't important. A lack of listening, not just in the court, but in life. I highlighted inconsistencies. A dated text message, a withdrawal slip with a mismatched signature, the kind of things that looked small but told larger stories. I noted them all carefully. Still, my mind returned to Harin more than I expected. I reread parts of her therapy reports one evening. Not for the case, just to remember. One note described how she calmed down when she watched ocean documentaries. Another said she often lined up her toys by color, not shape. There was a line in one of her father's emails that had stuck with me. I want her to experience more of the world, not less. It was a simple sentence, but it had weight. Weeks passed. The leaves turned to their rust-colored phase, then faded to gray. Winter crept in along the windowsills. The heating vents in the office hissed softly. One day, I returned to my desk to find a plain white envelope. This time, the handwriting was familiar. It was from Mr. So. The letter was brief. He said he had moved. A quieter neighborhood, near the ocean. He was working part-time and volunteering at a center for children with disabilities. He thanked me. He didn't say much else. Inside the envelope was another drawing, a smaller one. The same blue whale, but this time swimming under a calm sun. The lines were smoother. The ocean is less jagged. It wasn't dated. There was no note attached. Just the drawing. I placed it beside the original letter in my drawer. I didn't tell anyone. There was something different about the way I carried the cases after that. It wasn't louder or more emotional. I didn't change my habits, but I paid more attention to the quiet moments. The pauses in a client's body language. The words they didn't say. The way people folded their hands or looked out windows when they weren't sure. I understood better that listening wasn't just about hearing. It was about noticing. One afternoon while reviewing files in the reading room, I watched as an intern knocked over a stack of folders. He flinched, then tried to pick them up quickly. No one helped. People walked around him. He smiled to himself, like it was a small mistake, but I saw the way his hands trembled. I walked over and helped him stack the papers again. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He nodded without looking up. Then he straightened the folders and returned to work. It was a small thing, a quiet moment, but it felt important. In the months that followed, I continued with my work. Courtrooms, clients, files, the rhythm of law. Some cases were heavy, some routine, some ended without a clear resolution. But something inside me had adjusted. I no longer thought of myself as someone who just noticed things. I began to think of noticing as a responsibility, especially when others didn't. I remembered how Mr. So had stood alone in that hallway after the verdict. Not crying, not relieved, just still. There was meaning in that stillness. People thought courtroom drama came from shouting or surprise evidence. But often it came in silence, in being seen, in having your story told the way it actually happened, not how others expected it to. One evening, I walked past the bench by the river and saw the same boy from before, sitting alone, looking at the water. His headphones were around his neck this time. He didn't seem afraid. He was just watching the ripples. His mother stood nearby, speaking to someone on the phone. She wasn't watching him, but she didn't seem worried. I stood still for a moment. The boy looked up and saw me. He didn't react, just met my gaze for a few seconds. Then he turned back toward the river. I thought of Harin. Then I thought of the whale. Quiet, steady, moving through deep water with a kind of calm strength. Maybe the reason I liked whales so much wasn't just because they were graceful or rare. Maybe it was because they communicated across great distances, without needing to be loud. They just waited for someone who was listening. Back at my apartment that night, I opened my drawer and looked at the two drawings again. The second whale swam lower in the water, under softer light. There was no sunburst, just a pale yellow glow. I traced the lines with my finger. Then I placed the drawing back in its envelope and turned off the light. The room went dark, but the image stayed with me. A whale beneath the surface, not lost. Just be quiet, and still moving forward. After the verdict, I expected things to return to how they were. They did, in most ways. I rode the subway in the morning. I watched people press the buttons at the pedestrian crosswalks, even though I already knew the timing without needing to look. I sat at my desk at Hanbada, where the walls were pale and the air always faintly smelled of toner and coffee. But something had shifted. It wasn't loud or visible. I couldn't point to it or name it. It was like how water feels heavier before it rains. The case with Mr. So was over. His name had been cleared. The drawing of the whale his daughter made was stored in my desk, tucked between two pieces of firm backing to protect the edges. I hadn't told anyone about it. Still, every now and then, I opened the drawer and looked at it. The whale looked like it was still moving. I began walking more, not for exercise, but because the silence outside felt easier than the conversations inside. I walked after work, usually along the Han River path near the Banpo Bridge. The water was different every evening, sometimes still, sometimes rippling from the wind. But it always moved forward, which I liked. One afternoon, a man I didn't recognize sat on the bench I usually used. I considered walking past, but something about him made me pause. He was reading from a small brown notebook and wore dark-rimmed glasses. His posture was relaxed. There was a warmth in the way he folded one leg over the other, completely unbothered by the cold wind. I sat at the opposite end of the bench, a comfortable distance. He didn't look up. He continued reading, occasionally writing something in the margins. Minutes passed. Then he closed the notebook, placed it beside him, and looked out over the water the same way I often did. Quiet, thoughtful, not expecting anything, just watching. I didn't speak to him that day, but when I left, I felt aware of the space between us in a way I hadn't before. The next time I saw him, he was sitting in the same place. I hesitated again, but took my seat at the opposite end. It happened twice more that week. Each time, the distance between us felt slightly less intentional. Not close, not intimate, but familiar. He never brought a phone, only the same brown notebook. One evening, he dropped his pen. It rolled across the bench toward me. I picked it up and placed it back beside him. That was the first time he smiled. Not a wide smile, just a small one, the kind that barely lifts one side of the mouth. It made the moment feel warm, even though the air was cold. At work, I continued with a new case involving a family inheritance dispute. 2 siblings, both claiming they had their father's final will. The conflict was personal, tangled in years of resentment. The legal question was about signatures and witness statements. But the real problem was invisible, buried in things never said. It reminded me of the Seo case, not in facts, but in how easily people misunderstood each other, in how silence, left unchecked, turned into anger. One evening, after spending too long reading over conflicting testimonies, I found myself walking again. My feet moved without deciding. I ended up at the river. He was there. This time he was sketching. I sat down beside him, not far, not close. The wind made the pages flutter, and he placed a paperweight on the edge, a smooth stone with a tiny whale carved into it. I stared at the carving longer than I should have. He noticed. He turned the stone toward me and gave a small nod. Then, gently, he pushed the notebook across the bench and offered to look. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside were sketches of the river, benches, people, and animals. But on one page, there was a whale. Not detailed, but carefully drawn, swimming under a surface line, calm, moving forward. I closed the notebook slowly and returned it. We sat until the sun disappeared behind the skyline. Later that week, I stayed at the office later than usual. The hallway lights dimmed at 9. I preferred the quiet, but when I reached for my bag to leave, I found a small paper tucked under it. No name, just a folded corner and an ink drawing, a tiny whale. I stood still for a while. Then I tucked it into my coat pocket. His name was Junho. Not the same Junho I once knew. A different one. This one was a freelance illustrator who worked mostly at night and walked the river in the afternoons. He didn't ask questions. He never pressured. He just shared space. He began leaving drawings in the same spot where we sat. Always something small. A riverbank, a fish, a leaf caught in the current. Sometimes I left notes in return. Facts about whales. The average breath hold of a blue whale. The speed of an orca's tail flick. It wasn't conversation, but it was communication. And that was enough. One evening, he sat closer. Not very close. Just noticeably nearer. I brought my own sketch pad that day. I had drawn a whale breaching beneath the Banpo Bridge. I handed it to him. He studied it, then wrote something beneath the image. When he passed it back, I read his hiss. They always return to the surface. I didn't respond. But something shifted in my chest. I began thinking about him during the day. Not constantly. Just in small moments, when I passed the copier or when I ate lunch alone at my desk. I wondered if he would be at the river, if he had brought his sketchbook, if he would draw a whale again. I didn't tell anyone. Feelings were complicated. They didn't come with checklists or predictable rhythms like case files. They weren't always rational. But that didn't make them less real. Near the end of the month, I received a letter at the office. It was from Mr. Seo. He said he had moved near the ocean. He had started volunteering at a small center for neurodiverse children. He was working part-time. He thanked me again, though he didn't need to. Inside was another drawing, another whale, but this one was different. It was swimming next to a smaller whale. No sun, just the ocean. I stared at it for a long time. Then I walked to the river. Junho was already there, sitting on the bench, waiting. When he saw me, he stood, as if he had been unsure I would come. I handed him the drawing. He studied it with the same focus he used on his own sketches. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in a cloth. It was a carved orca, wood smoothed from time, almost exactly like the one I kept in my desk. He placed it in my hand. We stood like that for a moment, facing the river, not speaking. The sky above the water was a soft gradient, pale blue fading into dark. He took a small step closer, and I let him. Later that night, I placed the second whale drawing in my drawer next to the first. I traced the lines one more time. A large whale, a smaller one beside it, both moving forward. Not fast, just together.